You said there were two accounts? No, check again. The date isn't right. What did they actually—
Hands folded in her lap, still wearing the plain gray cardigan she had worn every day for 4 months while caring for two children who had no idea who she really was. The detective slid a folder across the table and asked her to confirm her name for the record. She looked at him for a long moment before she answered. "My name is Alina Voss," she said, "and I am worth over $300 million. The room went silent. Because for 4 months, the woman sitting in that chair had been known to everyone in that house only as the nanny. What she uncovered behind those walls would end a marriage, expose a conspiracy years in the making, and prove that the most dangerous people are rarely the ones who look dangerous at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why a woman with more money than most companies would ever see chose to scrub floors and pack lunches under a false name, you have to understand who Vanessa Cole was before any of this began, and who her mother had spent 30 years becoming. Alina Voss was not born into money. She grew up in a 2-bedroom house outside Akron, Ohio, the daughter of a machinist who worked double shifts and a mother who kept the family's books balanced with a pencil and a calculator that never left the kitchen table. Alina learned early that numbers did not lie, even when people did. By 26, she had built a small energy consulting firm out of a converted garage. By 50, that firm had become Voss Energy Holdings, one of the largest independent power companies in the Midwest. Vanessa was Alina's only child, raised with more comfort than her mother ever had, but with the same core lesson drilled into her from childhood. Trust is something you verify, not something you assume. Vanessa grew into a bright, warm woman who ran a nonprofit focused on childhood literacy, married relatively late at 34, and seemed, by every outward measure, to have built a life untouched by the kind of hardship her mother had clawed her way out of. Her husband, Preston Cole, was charming in the specific way that made people want to be near him without quite knowing why. He worked in private wealth management, dressed impeccably, and treated Alina with a warmth that, in hindsight, always felt 1 degree too calculated to be entirely real. For the first 3 years of the marriage, nothing seemed wrong. Vanessa and Preston had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and settled into a large home an hour outside the city that Alina had helped them purchase as a wedding gift. Alina visited often in those early years, and each visit reinforced what she wanted to believe, that her daughter had found a stable, happy life. It was only in the 4th year that Alina began noticing small inconsistencies during phone calls, moments where Vanessa seemed to lose her train of thought mid-sentence, or forget conversations they'd had only days earlier. Alina told herself it was exhaustion. 2 young children and a demanding nonprofit could explain almost anything, she reasoned, and for a while, she believed her own reasoning completely. The turning point came on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, when Alina arrived unannounced for her granddaughter's birthday and found Vanessa sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at a grocery list she could not seem to finish writing. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to recall the name of an ingredient she had used 100 times before. When Alina gently asked if she was all right, Vanessa laughed it off, blaming a new migraine medication Preston had suggested she try. Alina smiled and changed the subject, the way mothers learn to do when they sense a conversation is not ready to be had. But she left that afternoon with a knot in her stomach that would not loosen, no matter how many times she told herself she was imagining things. Alina did what she had always done when something did not add up in a balance sheet. She started asking quiet questions. She called Vanessa's oldest friend from college, who mentioned, almost in passing, that Vanessa had canceled 3 lunch dates in the last 2 months, each time citing headaches or fatigue that seemed to arrive with unusual convenience. She called the pediatrician's office under the guise of updating emergency contact information and learned, carefully and indirectly, that Vanessa had missed 2 of her children's routine appointments, something entirely unlike the meticulously organized daughter Alina had raised. None of it, on its own, meant anything. Together, it formed a pattern Alina recognized instinctively, the same instinct that had once told her which business partners were quietly steering a deal toward their own advantage instead of the company's. What Alina could not ignore was a conversation she overheard by accident during a visit 2 weeks later, when Preston, believing himself alone in his study, spoke on the phone in a tone she had never heard him use with anyone. He was discussing what he called the transition timeline with someone he referred to only as Dr. Halloran, mentioning dosage adjustments and the importance of documentation for what he called the competency filing. Alina stood frozen in the hallway outside the door, her pulse loud in her own ears, piecing together words that on their surface sounded almost clinical, almost reasonable, and yet carried an unmistakable weight of something being planned rather than treated. She said nothing that day. She drove home in silence, and by the time she reached her own front door, she had already decided what she needed to do. Alina could have hired a private investigator. She could have confronted Preston directly or brought in her own team of attorneys to demand answers. But she understood something about power that 30 years in business had taught her better than any lawyer could. The people closest to a situation are almost always the last to see it clearly, and the people trusted least are often the ones who see everything. So when Vanessa mentioned, weeks later, that their longtime nanny had left unexpectedly for a family emergency, Alina did not offer to help find a replacement. She quietly arranged, through a trusted former employee, to have a woman named Grace Miller, a warm, unassuming grandmother with excellent references and no connection whatsoever to the Voss or Cole name, apply for the position instead. Grace Miller did not exist 24 hours before Alina invented her. Alina spent 3 days learning to answer to a different name before she ever set foot in her daughter's kitchen as an employee. She dyed her silver-streaked hair a flatter, duller brown. She traded her tailored blazers for cardigans purchased specifically for the role, wore reading glasses she did not need, and practiced a slight Midwestern drawl thicker than her own natural accent, enough to blur the edges of a voice Preston might otherwise have recognized. It was not vanity that made this difficult. It was the sheer discipline required to stand in her own daughter's kitchen, to hold her own grandchildren, and to say nothing, ask nothing, reveal nothing, while every instinct in her screamed to pull Vanessa aside and demand the truth immediately. Alina reminded herself, every single morning, that acting too soon could cost her the proof she needed to protect her daughter permanently. The first month revealed more than Alina expected and confirmed less than she feared. She watched Preston administer Vanessa's evening medication personally each night, a small detail that struck Alina as unusual, since most husbands leave such routines to their wives or to written instructions on a countertop. She noticed the pill bottles were kept in a locked drawer in Preston's home office rather than the bathroom cabinet, where the children's medications sat in plain view. She began, carefully, and without ever appearing to search for anything, memorizing bottle labels during the brief windows when the drawer was left unlocked, committing names and dosages to memory the way she once memorized quarterly earnings reports before board meetings. What she found did not match any migraine treatment Alina had ever heard of. Grace Miller, as Alina now called herself daily without flinching, became close to Vanessa in a way that felt both natural and unbearable. Vanessa, unaware she was confiding in her own mother, spoke openly about feeling foggy, about losing time during the day, about a persistent unease she could not name but felt whenever Preston insisted, gently but firmly, that she rest instead of returning to work at her nonprofit. Alina listened as Grace Miller, the nanny, offering quiet, motherly encouragement that felt both like a performance and like the truest thing she had ever said to her daughter. She began keeping a private notebook hidden inside a paperback novel in her nanny's quarters, documenting dates, symptoms, medication schedules, and every fragment of the phone conversation she had overheard weeks earlier. The break Alina needed came from an unexpected source, a woman named Rosa Delgado, the family's longtime housekeeper who had grown suspicious of Preston long before Grace Miller ever arrived. Rosa had noticed changes in Vanessa over the past year that unsettled her deeply, and one afternoon, while folding laundry together, Rosa confided quietly that she had once seen a document on Preston's desk labeled Guardianship and Trust Restructuring, dated nearly 8 months earlier, far before anyone in the family had ever discussed such a thing being necessary. Alina felt something cold settle in her chest as Rosa described it. 8 months earlier was almost exactly when Vanessa's symptoms had first begun. It was not a coincidence Alina was willing to accept, and it gave her, for the first time, a clear direction to aim her investigation. Working carefully through contacts she trusted from her decades in business, Alina discovered that Dr. Marcus Halloran, the name she had overheard Preston mention on the phone, was not Vanessa's regular physician at all, but a psychiatrist Preston had quietly retained 6 months earlier, one whose practice specialized in competency evaluations for wealthy families navigating guardianship disputes. Alina obtained, through a former colleague with connections in medical licensing oversight, records showing Halloran had billed nearly a dozen consultations for Vanessa that Vanessa herself had no memory of attending. Appointments that had taken place during hours when Vanessa believed she was simply resting at home under sedation Preston had personally administered. The pieces, once scattered and uncertain, now formed a shape Alina recognized with sickening clarity. A plan to have her own daughter declared legally incompetent. The plan, as Alina eventually pieced together in full, was elegant in its cruelty. Preston had married into a family with significant wealth, but the trust structure Alina had established years earlier kept Vanessa, not Preston, as the primary controlling party over both the children's inheritance and a substantial portion of Voss Energy Holdings itself, a safeguard Alina had built specifically to protect her daughter's independence. If Vanessa were declared incompetent through a documented pattern of cognitive decline, guardianship would default, under the terms Preston's own attorneys had quietly drafted into an amended estate plan Vanessa had signed months earlier while under medication she did not fully understand, directly to her husband. It was not a crime born of sudden desperation. It had been built slowly, deliberately, dosage by dosage, appointment by appointment, over the better part of a year. Alina knew that confronting Preston directly, without ironclad proof, risked losing everything, including access to her own grandchildren if Preston moved quickly enough to control the narrative first. So she did what she had done throughout her entire career whenever the stakes reached their highest point. She built a case so complete that no lawyer, no judge, and no reputation could dismantle it. She photographed the medication bottles. She obtained copies of Halloran's billing records through a licensed investigator she brought in under strict confidentiality once she had enough evidence to justify the risk. She recorded, with Rosa's help and full legal consent under state law, 2 conversations in which Preston discussed the guardianship timeline in explicit terms with someone Alina would later learn was his own brother, an attorney complicit in drafting the very documents meant to strip Vanessa of her rights. The unraveling began on an ordinary Tuesday evening, when Alina, still wearing the cardigan and the name that was not hers, asked to speak privately with Vanessa while Preston was traveling for what he called a business trip. Alina told her daughter everything, methodically, the way she once delivered difficult news to a board of directors, laying out facts without embellishment and letting the truth carry its own weight. Vanessa's first reaction was disbelief, then confusion, then a slow, dawning horror as fragments of the past year rearranged themselves into a pattern she had been too medicated and too trusting to see clearly on her own. By the time Alina finished speaking, Vanessa was staring at her mother's face beneath the dyed hair and the reading glasses, recognizing her for the first time in months, not as Grace Miller, but as the mother who had never actually left her side. What followed moved quickly once Vanessa, clear-headed and furious, agreed to a supervised medical evaluation at a hospital of her own choosing rather than Halloran's office. An evaluation that confirmed, within 72 hours, that every symptom she had experienced aligned precisely with the medication Preston had been administering, substances entirely unnecessary for any condition Vanessa actually had. Law enforcement became involved once medical evidence corroborated Alina's documentation, and Preston was arrested attempting to access a safety deposit box containing the original amended estate documents before Vanessa's attorneys could secure them. Halloran's medical license was suspended pending a full investigation into what regulators would later describe as one of the more calculated guardianship fraud schemes they had encountered in over a decade of oversight. a case study now used in training seminars for elder and dependent adult protection statutes across 3 states. The most unexpected twist came not from Preston or Halloran, but from Preston's brother, the attorney who had drafted the amended trust documents. Facing his own potential prosecution, he agreed to cooperate fully, revealing that the scheme had actually originated over a year before Alina ever noticed the first warning signs, and that an earlier, smaller test of the same medication had been run on Vanessa during a period Alina had dismissed as ordinary postpartum exhaustion after her second child was born. It meant the plan had been in motion far longer than anyone imagined, patient, cautious, adjusted whenever Vanessa's family visited too closely, which explained, with chilling clarity, why symptoms always seemed to fade whenever Alina was in town and returned only after she left. Alina had not caught the beginning of the plan. She had only caught it before it finished. Preston was convicted 18 months later on multiple counts, including conspiracy and the unauthorized administration of controlled substances, receiving a sentence that ensured he would have no contact with Vanessa or the children for the foreseeable future. Halloran lost his medical license permanently and faced separate charges related to falsified competency records. Vanessa, once fully recovered, chose not to rebuild the life she had before, but a new one entirely, taking a more active leadership role within the very foundation her mother had built decades earlier, determined that her own children would grow up understanding exactly what her mother had taught her far too late to prevent the first year of harm, but early enough to end it before it became permanent. Alina never wore the cardigan again, though she kept it folded in a drawer, a reminder of the 4 months she spent as someone else to save the person she loved most. Was justice truly served in a case like this, when the man responsible walked free after less than 2 decades behind bars for a plan that could have erased a woman's autonomy entirely? Would you have recognized the warning signs Alina caught, the missed appointments, the locked drawer, the conveniently timed exhaustion, or would they have passed you by the way they nearly passed her? Let us know in the comments what stood out to you most and what you think you would have done in Alina's position. If this story kept you watching until the very end, wait until you hear what happened when a housekeeper discovered a hidden will that changed everything for a family who never suspected she was watching far more closely than they realized. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming true story videos.